Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2021 fantasy football season. Of course, on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the impact that matchups have in the fantasy football landscape. You know, on a weekly basis throughout the entirety of this upcoming season, I'm going to be talking about matchups as I've done in years past, because the impact of matchups is beyond what a lot of people give it credit for. You know, a lot of people want to focus on opportunity, and I always mention that opportunity is king in fantasy football, whether that is rushing attempts, targets, red zone targets, which of course touchdowns are the name of the game in majority of the positions that we see on a weekly basis. But on top of that, snaps played, routes run, there are a lot of metrics that give us potential understanding as to what we can see in a given week. But one of the more valuable ones, something that's often overlooked, is matchups. Whether or not the wide receiver that I have in my starting lineup is playing against the secondary or a cornerback that can't cover, whether my slot wide receiver is playing against the best slot corner in the entire National Football League. These are things that have to be taken into account, because if we're not accounting for them, then we can have a potential blind spot this upcoming season and have a performance that we didn't anticipate. Like I always say, no stone unturned. So on today's episode, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to be talking about the wide receiver position and the matchups in which wide receivers have the most advantageous or perhaps most disadvantageous matchups going into the 2021 season, and how their value potentially changes from that. And of course, if we see wide receivers that are going to have a 7-game stretch of incredibly beneficial matchups, why not go after those guys, benefit from those matchups and the corners that they're going to play against, and potentially expose this upcoming season. So that's what we'll talk about. Of course, I'll talk about the statistics and the way I've broken down these stats to kind of give myself the best understanding and potentially most accurate depiction of the strength of schedule in 2021. On top of that, to close today's episode, we're going to focus on multiple spans of time. Similar to the way I did it in yesterday's running back video, we're going to talk about these schedules between weeks 1 through 7, 8 through 14, and then lastly, of course, the fantasy football playoffs, talking about which wide receivers from weeks 15, 16, and 17 give us the best opportunity of capturing a 2021 fantasy football championship. Now, before we get into today's content, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support, almost getting us to 37,000 subscribers. So if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the season. Again, we're going to be talking about strength of schedules at the quarterback, tight end position later on this week. We'll have the tier list videos coming just down the line that are definitely going to help you this upcoming season, if in fact you're drafting soon. All of that this offseason, going into the regular season, which of course, like I mentioned, when I do my weekly rankings, we talk about matchups in order to give ourselves as many advantages against our league mates. Now, if you're trying to go ahead and get another advantage this upcoming offseason, go ahead and check out Andrew Kirchhoff's 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. For those of you who are interested in acquiring this, you can go down to the description of the video and check out my Patreon and or the website. You can find it both there. I do appreciate you guys supporting the channel, for those of you who have already gone to Patreon and taken advantage of those services, and for those of you who have purchased the draft guide separately, thank you very much. All right, now that we've covered that, we've got a lot to talk about, but I don't want to bore you. I want to get right into it and talk about the strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. Now, as you can see on screen, we have the first column that is labeled in the very top, titled 2020 fantasy points allowed versus wide receivers. To give you some context as to what this means, we have teams ranked 1 through 32. The number 1 ranked team gave up the most points to opposing wide receivers on average in a half PPR scoring format last season, which was the Atlanta Falcons. In fact, they gave up 37.61 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, that number trickles all the way down to the team that gave up the least amount of points to opposing wide receivers last season, which was the Los Angeles Rams, only giving up 22.09 fantasy points per game. Now, that's, of course, an average over the 16 games of last year, just taking that into perspective. Now, if we take those numbers and determine, okay, these were the strength of schedule of last season. These were the numbers and the things that we wanted to take advantage of. Oh, are we playing against the Atlanta Falcons this week? I'm going to start X or Y wide receiver, because they're going to benefit from the fact that that secondary was dealing with injuries, had a lot of rookies there, had a coaching change. There were multiple variables that led to the fact that the Atlanta Falcons couldn't stop anybody defensively, and especially in the secondary. Same thing with the Tennessee Titans with injuries, Detroit Lions rookie play that just wasn't up to par. These are things that we took advantage of last season, and maybe if in fact we inject it into our 2021 schedules, we can find some success there. Unfortunately, that is not going to be the case, because there are going to be players that are changing places. You're going to have old faces in new places and maybe new faces in new places. You got rookies coming in from the NFL draft. You have veterans like, let's say, for example, a secondary member of the Arizona Cardinals, formerly Patrick Peterson. He's gone ahead and he's going to the Minnesota Vikings. He's going to be the starting corner there. That definitely is going to make an impact in terms of what this defense can potentially produce this upcoming season, and it's going to make a difference on both teams. So instead of going ahead and just injecting these statistics into the 2021 season in terms of who has the most advantageous matchup to the least, calculating it accordingly and determining who has the easiest schedule, which in this case would have been the San Francisco 49ers, I wanted to go ahead and take another step. Now, sure, we're going to reference back to these statistics because they are going to play a role in the entire scheme of this. Yes, there are going to be changes in terms of which defenses have which players and the rookies coming in and whether or not they're going to make immediate impacts. That is certainly something that I wanted to go ahead and cover, but we'll reference back to this in just a bit. I wanted to, of course, apply those players into the new defenses. For example, let's talk about some of the defensive players that were drafted in the draft. Micah Parsons, he's a guy that is going to make an impact for that Dallas Cowboys linebacking core, whether he covers or does, it doesn't matter. There are going to be players that come in and make a difference, whether it is J.C. Horn, a cornerback for the Carolina Panthers, Patrick Surtain, who is going to be playing cornerback for the Denver Broncos. These are all guys that are first-round picks on top of the free agents. So what I went ahead and did is I went and I found the pass coverage grade for every single first and second string defender on all 32 National Football League teams. When I went ahead and did so, I found that the pass coverage average for these teams ranked accordingly. The number one ranked team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, have the best overall average in terms of grades for pass coverage in the National Football League going into the 2021 season based on the talent that they've either acquired or had last season going into this year in terms of the grades that they produced. Now, in terms of pass coverage grades, it really is apparent that this seems to be correct based on the fact that Pittsburgh, the Ravens, the Packers, Denver Broncos, Tampa Bay, these are great secondaries. The Indianapolis Colts, of course, the Cleveland Browns, the number 7 overall ranked team in this specific scenario. They had a lot of free agents and rookies came in that definitely bolstered their score in comparison to the teams that are on the bottom of this list. The Las Vegas Raiders, of course, they're in shambles. Their secondary can't cover a soul. They have the Detroit Lions down there. Jeff Okudah was the number 3 overall pick in 2020, but unfortunately didn't make that much of an impact. And yes, the Detroit Lions secondary, they were in shambles themselves because all the injuries they faced and the different rotations that they had. They traded Darius Slay the year before. It was just a mess. But either way, taking this into account, the averages of the grades in terms of pass coverage from all of these first and second string defenders on all these teams, we go ahead and then apply that to the 2021 schedule. The 17 weeks, or specifically the 16 games that we are all going to be participating in our upcoming fantasy football season. And we find that the New York Giants, Philadelphia Eagles, Washington Football Team, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Atlanta Falcons, Denver Broncos have the best schedules, while on the very bottom of this list, we have Cincinnati Bengals, Cleveland Browns, Detroit Lions, Chargers that are going to have disadvantageous matchups for majority of the season. Now, you may be wondering what's the analysis for this going into the 2021 season, but I didn't stop here in terms of statistics. I went ahead and I took these statistics. I took the aforementioned statistics from the 2020 season, and I went ahead and I threw that into another Excel sheet, and I went ahead and broke down what potentially is going to be the 2021 fantasy football strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, something that in my opinion is far more accurate than just determining the past, the potential present, but now we're going to potentially predict the future with the graphic on screen. The 2021 official wide receiver strength of schedule. As you can see on screen, we have the San Francisco 49ers currently holding the number 1 spot for the easiest strength of schedule from weeks 1 through 17. While on the other end of the spectrum, we unfortunately have the Cleveland Browns, Cincinnati Bengals, Las Vegas Raiders. Like I just, mentioned before, these are teams that in both cases, in both of the prior columns that I mentioned, we're always struggling in terms of their upcoming schedule. We went ahead and we found the averages in that entire scheme and have produced our 2021 fantasy football strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. Now, I'll give you some analysis here because this is our official list. Now, what I'm sure we're all doing at home right now is looking at the top 12 and seeing, is our starting wide receivers from our fantasy teams associated with those offenses? And though it is very intriguing to potentially see that the San Francisco 49ers are going to have the easiest strength of schedule this upcoming season, thinking about Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel this upcoming year, what their potential is based on their strength of schedule, other receivers that we may not think about that are often afterthoughts Kenny Golladay, Sterling Shepard, do they have the potential based on top of the fact that they're going to have an easier schedule this season? They get to play against the NFC South, which again is the Atlanta Falcons, Carolina Panthers, New Orleans Saints, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Those are often shootouts. On top of the fact that they get to play against the AFC East, you get to play against the Jets, the Miami Dolphins. Perhaps maybe if in fact these defenses are going to be giving up points to opposing wide receivers, regardless of who the quarterback is or the wide receivers are, maybe we can go ahead and find some value there when typically we wouldn't be looking in that direction. The Carolina Panthers, DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, this certainly in conjunction with the potential of Sam Darnold helps overall our confidence in what we can anticipate from those wide receivers. And though they are being drafted later on, maybe you go ahead and take a flyer on them. The Washington football team, of course, we have Terry McLaurin, who is on the thumbnail for a reason. We'll talk about him in an expansive list, but a wide receiver like Terry McLaurin, who is going to be funnel targeted from Ryan Fitzpatrick, having a very advantageous matchup is something we want to take advantage of. As you can see, the Giants, the Washington football team, the Philadelphia Eagles, 3 teams that are within the top 11 in terms of strength of schedule. Like I mentioned, the divisions that they play against this upcoming season are very advantageous. When you play against the NFC South, when you play against the Jets, the Raiders, those are matchups that you definitely want to go after, and those are great things, but those don't encompass the entire season. You're still going to have to play teams within your own division. We know that, of course, the Washington football team is a tougher secondary, but the Eagles aren't that good in terms of their secondary. Outside of James Bradbury, there's nobody really that I'm worried about for the Giants. The Dallas Cowboys, I know they've changed their defensive coordinator, brought in help, brought in some different players, but I don't think that's changing anytime soon. There are a lot of variables to take into account in terms of the strength of schedule here. Now, for those of you who are looking and trying to find your player that is associated with the team and what their strength of schedule potentially looks like, I, of course, want to mention the fact that though the Cleveland Browns have the toughest strength of schedule this year, or the Cincinnati Bengals or the Raiders, it does not mean that we're avoiding those players. There are going to be players that, regardless of strength of schedule, are going to produce. We've seen it year in and year out. There are going to be times where, on a given week, the player that you have is playing against the toughest matchup, but they're still going to score 20 points. Because, that's fantasy football. Things happen. But this just gives us an extra layer of potential in predicting what's going to happen in the future. Though it says, Cincinnati Bengals are going to struggle, it doesn't mean that T. Higgins is not going to go for 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns this year, because the opportunity is going to be there. And yes, the matchups are going to be a little bit more difficult, but he's still going to break through because he has talent. They're not just, ones and zeros at this point. They have extra variables that give them advantages. Similar to when we talked about Christian McCaffrey or Zeke yesterday having the tougher matchups, we're not going to completely shun them away because they are matchup proof for majority of the games that they play in. Now that we've covered the strength of schedule at the wide receiver position for the 2021 season, I want to take it another step like I always do. I always try to be better. Let's go ahead and let's look at specific spans of time. Let's look at the first 7 weeks, then which is weeks 1 through 7, then the next 7 weeks of the season, weeks 8 through 14, and in the final 3 weeks, which is weeks 15, 16, and 17, the fantasy football playoffs, where championships are won and legacies are, of course, built within your leagues. So let's talk about weeks 1 through 7 and who exactly has the most advantageous matchups in that span of time. Now, of course, there are teams. In fact, there are 10 teams that have bye weeks in week 7 and 6 combined. So those teams, yes, we've gone ahead and calculated accordingly where the denominator there is for 6 games because they're only playing 6 games. I'm not counting the bye week as a game. Do not worry. The numbers are correct. I triple checked everything. So just to kind of put it in perspective, the Carolina Panthers, New England Patriots, Philadelphia Eagles, Minnesota Vikings, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they sit at the top in terms of the top 5 easiest schedule or the most advantageous schedule for their wide receivers off rip. Beginning with the Carolina Panthers, the number 1 ranked team in terms of strength of schedule throughout this span of time, they get to play the New York Jets right off the rip. Sam Darnold, you get to go home and have a revenge game. That looks good for your wide receivers there. Then you play against the New Orleans Saints. That though they have Marshawn Lattimore and they do have a couple good safeties in terms of coverage, they have been exposed at times from year to year. But if in fact you're not too excited about that matchup, even though DJ Moore has had himself some good games against that team, you get the Houston Texans matchup. Oh my God, that's easy. Dallas Cowboys, then the Philadelphia Eagles, then the Minnesota Vikings. That though they still have Harrison Smith, they have a couple guys that Cameron Dantzler, they've brought in a couple rookies. They're still going to be struggling. And then you get the New York Giants. I think that's a very strong strength of schedule, and based on my calculations, that went ahead and was, not by a wide margin, but was the easiest strength of schedule. Let's look at the New England Patriots. Yes, there aren't many wide receivers that we can immediately trust, but guys, let's be honest, wide receivers like Jacoby Myers are often going undrafted in many of our leagues. For those of you guys who are just completely ignoring him, maybe we want to go ahead and take another look at him. Playing against Miami, then, of course, the New York Jets, New Orleans Saints, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Houston, Dallas, Jets again. Those are great matchups in my opinion, and there's a reason why the New England Patriots are sitting at the top of this list. If you want to go ahead and invest in a Devonta Smith, of course, for those of us who are getting the benefits of not only getting a valuable wide receiver like an Adam Thielen or Justin Jefferson, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin off the rip, you're going to be benefited from the fact that their schedules, as you can see from weeks 1 through 7, are fantastic. When we look at the other side of the spectrum, of course, the Detroit Lions, they're going to be in trouble. The thing that I immediately think is, okay, the Detroit Lions, they have the toughest strength of schedule. When I look at the top cornerbacks of some of these teams, the Green Bay Packers, Jair Alexander, the Baltimore Ravens, Marlon Humphreys. I mean, that in itself, weeks 2 and 3, that's already a nightmare just off the rip. I think the San Francisco 49ers with Jason Verrett, they've got some great corners. But the Detroit Lions also don't have any good wide receivers. So we're not too worried about it. We're, no love lost. We're okay. Then we move on to the Houston Texans. Any wide receivers there? Brandon Cooks. Yeah, he plays Jacksonville week 1. Cleveland, he's probably going to be every game he's probably going to be double covered. Not looking great. The Washington football team. Now, unfortunately, our thumbnail, Terry McLaurin, is going to have himself a little bit of a struggle off the rip. Now, like I mentioned earlier, they do have one of the easier strength of schedules throughout the entire season. But yet they are sitting at the bottom of this list from weeks 1 through 7. It's because the back end of his schedule is so ridiculously good. This is one of the players that I'm going to suggest now as a guy that whether you draft him or not, Terry McLaurin, perhaps Curtis Samuel down the line can be receiving options that you're either picking up or trading for in the second half of the season, because the matchups that they have, not only from weeks 8 through 14, but from weeks 15, 16, and 17 in the fantasy football playoffs are ridiculously good and something you have to keep your eye out on. We'll, of course, talk about that in a bit. The Cincinnati Bengals, a team that's also, once again, on the bottom here. But the Las Vegas Raiders, outside of going for perhaps the John Brown lottery ticket or the Ruggs lottery ticket, it's going to be tough. Now, let's look at the Kansas City Chiefs. They have the 27th toughest strength of schedule in this span of time. Does that mean I'm avoiding the wide receivers of that team? Absolutely not, because they have one wide receiver. His name is Tyreek Hill, and that's the only one I'm going for. Outside of that, it's Travis Kelce or bust. Thank you very much. We keep it moving. But again, just giving you some perspective. Let's move on from weeks 8 through 14. Who's got an incredible schedule? We talked about Terry McLaurin in just a minute, and here he comes raging back. Yes, they have a week 9 bye week, but they get to play against Denver, which of course is difficult. You got a lot of corners there that definitely want smoke. But weeks 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, my goodness, you couldn't ask for any easier matchups. Playing against the NFC South is always great, but then also playing against Las Vegas, they don't have good corners. Seattle, they don't have good corners. Dallas, they've always struggled. These are teams that last season gave up the most points to opposing wide receivers by a wide margin. A lot of these teams. But as long as Ryan Fitzpatrick, Terry McLaurin are ready to go, they should have a great opportunity. Let's talk about the New Orleans Saints. Weeks 8 through 14 sounds a lot like when Michael Thomas returns. Maybe you go ahead, you take a late round flyer, you invest in Michael Thomas, and when in fact he comes back, when Jameis is the starter, once they realize Taysom Hill can't throw the ball, you find yourself in an opportunity to play Michael Thomas, who's fully healthy at that point, against some of the division's worst defenses: Atlanta, Tennessee, Philadelphia, Buffalo, Dallas, the New York Jets. Not a bad option there, guys, I'm telling you. Of course, the Denver Broncos, Jerry Jeudy's of the world, Cortland Sutton's. The Houston Texans, they have a little bit of an anime revenge arc here, but I'm going to be honest, I'm still a little bit weary as to what the quarterback play is going to look like there and whether it's going to be worth it. Matthew Stafford in the second half of the year playing against Houston, Tennessee, San Francisco, Green Bay, Jacksonville, Arizona. With those wide receivers, could take the next step forward. Anyway, just kind of giving you some perspective here as to what the strength of schedule looks like from weeks 8 through 14, the second half of our regular season fantasy football schedule. Because again, don't forget, our fantasy football schedule, if we don't make the playoffs, is week 1 through 14. And I guarantee you, for those of you who get eliminated by then, hopefully you won't because you're listening to me and you're following and you're subscribing, of course. I turned into angry dad mode. But the whole point is, for majority of us, if in fact you get eliminated by then, Those 14 weeks is your regular season. After that, it's the playoffs. So for many of you at that point, your season will be over. Maybe you'll stop watching football as a whole, but hopefully that won't be the case, of course. Come on, we're locking it in this year. Here we go. The final statistics I want to talk about are 2021 fantasy playoffs. The schedule weeks 15, 16, and 17. Again, I have to mention it, PSA, tell your league managers, your commissioners, to make sure you are not playing in a week 18 championship, because if you do so, you will be subject to the worst week 18 of your life. If you're in that championship game, you're going to wish you never were, unless, of course, you win in the bag. That's a different conversation. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of the analysis. The San Francisco 49ers, they retake the number 1 spot, and they look like they have an incredible schedule. Look at that schedule. Of course, we talked about the benefits that wide receivers have, but in turn, the quarterback position is going to benefit as well, because if wide receivers are scoring all these points, what is the quarterback going to look like? And who's the quarterback going to be for the San Francisco 49ers in week 15, 16, and 17? Will it be Trey Lance? We'll talk about that tomorrow, of course, on our Wednesday episode in terms of strength of schedule for the quarterback position. But again, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel. It's going to be a matter of who's healthy by then, because those guys miss games like nobody else. Either way, Washington football team, Terry McLaurin, the Arizona Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins is going to benefit there. The Detroit Lions have found themselves in the conversation of, can we potentially start one of their receiving options? Hopefully by then, Amon St. Brown, whether it is Brashard Perriman, Tyrell Williams, one of them have broken out and solidified themselves as number 1. But if that isn't the case, then we're going to be struggling. Wide receivers from the Chicago Bears, the number 6 right here against Minnesota, Seattle, and then the New York Giants. I like Darnell Mooney in that kind of stretch. But again, this is way down the line. We are just talking about it as a surface level strength of schedule, just looking at what we can anticipate. Cincinnati wide receivers are in trouble. Playing against Denver, Baltimore, then KC. Those are tough secondaries, guys. That is going to be tough for Joe Burrow. But again, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Hopefully the information I've presented today gives you an understanding as to what kind of potential these wide receivers have based on the matchups they play this upcoming season. Again, to close today's video, I want to go ahead and take another look at the 2021 wide receiver strength of schedule with, of course, the 49ers on the top all the way to the Browns on the bottom. Though perhaps your wide receiver doesn't have the most advantageous strength of schedule, look at the differences in terms of the average strength of schedule scores that I've gone ahead and determined. They're not that big of a difference. The difference between a 5.00 and a 5.03 isn't that, it's practically irrelevant at that point. But the difference between a 14.16 and a 20 certainly is, because the averages begin to build up, and once you go ahead and calculate it across the board, plays a big difference. But that's the math brain going off. Let's just talk about the fantasy brain. Hopefully you don't take this too much at its face value. Yes, some of these teams are going to have tougher schedules, but you don't want to outright avoid them. Just because number 26, the Green Bay Packers, are there, doesn't mean Devontae Adams isn't completely going off. He's matchup proof. He's a stud. Understand that, and of course, use this list responsibly. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Click that like button down below, and let me know what you guys think about today's episode down in the comment section. Thank you very much, everybody. Make sure you check out down in the description. We have my link to my Patreon and to my website for those of you who are looking for my 2021 fantasy football draft guide. Outside of that, I'll see you guys tomorrow as we talk about quarterbacks. Have a good one. Stay healthy. I'll see you guys. Peace.